So I'm Writing a Novel is the show where you join me, Oliver Brackenbury, on the journey of writing my next novel. From first ideas all the way to publication and promotion. In this one-man reality show, I'll share with you my ever-evolving thoughts and feelings on how I write, being a writer, and everything that entails at each stage of the process. I'll also answer listener questions and, sometimes, interview people who write fiction. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn how things are made and get to know the people making them, then this is the show for you. And this show, I actually am finally interviewing somebody. Somebody's actually 2 guests for the price of 1 free download. I'm interviewing Remco van Straten and Angeline B. Adams, a pair of authors who work together in Northern Ireland, where they live, and their novel, The Red Man and Others, is the book of the hour here. It is a collection of sword and sorcery short stories that add up to a greater tale when read all in order. And I strongly recommend it. I read it a little earlier in the year, back in the early spring, and I loved it. Plus, for me, it was a real just gust of air in my wings as I was having some doubts about, why have I tied myself to sword and sorcery? Isn't it kind of an old genre? Will people like it? I don't know. Is it possible to write new sword and sorcery that takes it further without being an empty copy of the old stuff? Well, reading The Red Man and Others made it clear you can do that, and that my fears were unfounded. So yeah, if nothing else, I'm really grateful for how this book was essentially a big dose of unintentional encouragement for me with my own project. But enough about me, let's get to the interview. Hi guys.
Hello.
Hiya.
So I'm here with Angeline and Remco. Could you each take turns? We'll start with Angeline, telling our listeners who you are. What's your whole deal?
I'm Angeline Adams. I write sword and sorcery and folk horror. I also blog at Turnip Lanterns, and I'm the co-author of The Red Man and Others.
And I'm Remco, and I do pretty much the same as Angeline because we're writing together.
Right, and what is The Red Man and Others beyond a great sword and sorcery book I've really enjoyed?
Well, these are stories of a found family of con artists. Kayla is a small but tough sellsword and the reluctant mentor to Sebastian. He is a teenage con artist with a big heart and a quick pickpocketing hand. And then there's Imka. She is a disabled scribe and forger who has escaped a war-torn childhood, found love with Kayla, and they've been getting into trouble together ever since.
Yeah, and it's we did want to write sword and sorcery. As it turns out, the stories, well, we still class them as sword and sorcery, but there is not a lot of sword play going on, and it's very light on sorcery as well. But,
We're pushing the boundaries of the genre.
Yes.
Well, I really liked it, even though, yes, maybe it didn't have, hordes of people being slain every other chapter and dark, terrible Cthulhu type stuff crawling out of the woodwork. It still felt very like sword and sorcery to me. It had one aspect that I really love about the genre is how it often feels much more grounded and it's kind of bottom-up perspective, and absolutely, that was there, for example. First thing I'd love to ask is, why sword and sorcery? Why this genre that either people think died in the 80s or that, they associate with kind of like bad action movies, or I think in most cases they just figure as a synonym for fantasy in general? Now, I say this as someone who loves it and is writing his own sword and sorcery book, so believe me. But I'm curious, what drew you to it over, say, high fantasy or grim dark or any of the other things?
I think that there's really 2 strands to that. First of all, we each in our different ways grew up with it. Remco was reading Robert E. Howard from an early age. I grew up with Thundercats as basically my first fandom. So you had Sword and Planet with various other influences dragged in. And I think that aesthetic and those ideas and that atmosphere have been dragging me back ever since. But I think that because of the kinds of stories that we're telling and the kinds of characters that we are telling them about, I think that sword and sorcery appeals to us because it's about surviving in a dangerous world, living by your wits and your sword. And in a metaphorical way, I think a lot of us feel like that right now. We're living in an increasingly difficult, complex world. We're under threat in lots of different ways. And fantasy is a great way to deal with all sorts of things, whether you're a writer kind of sort of subtly working your own trauma in there, or a reader who wants escapism but also wants to come away from a story feeling like, yeah, life is survivable.
Yeah, and we in particularly wanted to focus on characters who are, well, like us in a way. and have their traumas, have their disabilities, have their obstacles, but they are still able to thrive in that milieu, in that environment, and able to survive and able to
And able to do it, I think, with a little bit of style and flourish and humor as well. There's a lot of humor in there too, despite the slightly grim parts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I remember really enjoying it, the humor in it. And actually, what you just said reminded me of something I really liked, Angeline, that you said in the making of section at the back of the book, which, by the way, thank you for including that. I love that stuff. You said something in there about Ayumka and non-violent resistance being a kind of, very important part of the character, and part of how, like, that's resistance too. It doesn't have to be punching guys necessarily.
I think it is. I mean, especially we're in a strange period in history, and there's sometimes a lot of rhetoric about the idea that to be resisting tyranny or resisting oppression, you have to be out there on the battle, out there on the barricades, physically fighting hand to hand. But Imka survives in a situation where she believes that her life is never going to change. She's growing up on a rural farm in a war-torn landscape with a very paranoid, secretive father. And because of all those things and because of her disability, she doesn't see a way out, but there is something in her that survives anyway.
Yeah, and when we meet her again in The Return of the Uncomplaining Child, she tells about how she got there and how she established herself in that environment she finds herself in. And that is an example of resistance as well, because what she does is, she basically refuses to play the rules of that society. And she said, like, this doesn't make any sense. I am going to follow my own rules, or I am going to take these rules and see how I can break out of them or use them to my own advantage. So there is this whole complicated system of apprenticeship. And at the end of apprenticeship as a scribe, you would get your diploma, and only then you can establish yourself. So, and she doesn't see a way out of it, because she thinks, like, the only people who can get this certificate are the people who actually have the money to pay for it, or the influence. So what does she do? She just writes this certificate herself. And that's enough for her to, get by.
And it's also kind of the gateway drug to breaking the law in other ways as well.
That was one of my absolute favorite moments in the book, as someone who has learned a lot of theoretically marketable skills by producing things to put out online, but doesn't actually have certification for them. Yeah. No, I got a big kick out of that. And I did like that as a gateway to crimes and other things.
That came directly from my life as well, because I've had relatively little formal education because my health just completely derailed. Going to school. I didn't go to university, but I kind of had to create a journalism career out of nothing. And like Imka, I ran into the sort of the unfairnesses that are inherent to the system. And so that was, I think that I was writing that on a slightly bitter day, but I made it funny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and having done our journalism, we worked in the arts sector here, or we wrote about the arts sector here, doing theater reviews, and reviews for movies,
Art
bands,
galleries, all sorts of things.
Anything that was thrown at us. And at a certain point, we got comments to our articles like, well, these people, they think that they have done theater school and they can just do reviews. And we went like, thank you very much. Because we haven't.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that brings me to another question. I'm curious. First, Angeline, then Remco. Could you tell me, as children, were you encouraged to write? Who did this to you?
My mother. I grew up in a house filled with books. My mother has always written herself. And so, as well as her, I had teachers who encouraged me very early on. And I don't think that anyone ever considered that I wouldn't end up writing. And of course, in some ways, It's a product of unfortunate circumstances as well, because I've been very thrown on my own resources by the fact that I didn't go through a normal experience of university and jobs. So it became a form of expression, but it's also a thing that I can very practically do when other options aren't open.
Hmm, I Well, I did get encouragement from my family. We are a family of readers. Other people would always remark that there were always books around the house and on the table. Um, so how it started for me is when I was about 5 or 6. I saw the original King Kong film on the television, and that stuck with me, even though I spent half of the time, behind the sofa not watching it. And I don't know why, but when I was 8, I decided to make my own book of it. So we had this really big ancient typewriter, one of those cast iron machines. And I started pounding out my own novelization of it. And the thing with that is, it was very heavy to operate the typewriter. So I had to have a pencil in my fist and stab at the keys. And yeah, so that's how my writing career started. Then when going to high school, I joined the school newspaper, and when I studied further, I kept doing that. And yeah.
We do still have the King Kong story, by the way. It's survived
Oh,
for years.
excellent! I love it. Angeline? Do you remember your first crack at writing a novel? Was it translating a movie you'd watched, like Remco, or something else?
I had a lot of false starts at novels whenever I was a child. Like my primary school years are full of like novels where I designed the cover. I wrote something very basic, and that's as far as it went. But in my mid 20s, I started working on something that was not fun. Well, very bare sort of layer of fantasy over it, but was basically very autobiographical, very much about where I grew up, and family stuff kind of twisted to hopefully make it unrecognizable. And it's still sort of in a semi-written state. It's out there somewhere. It will surface one day.
Yeah, I think I did short stories and comic books. I always tried to get an artist friend to draw my dumb superhero ideas or whatever. It wasn't until I was 19 and I wrote the first 20 pages of what was a post-apocalyptic story that was very obviously about me and a girl I had a crush on in the post-apocalyptic ruins of the small town where I was raised. Yeah, maybe I'll make that like a really big Patreon goal for down the road. If you have me reading that out to people, we'll see what happens. So I think we've touched on it a little bit, but I'm curious, Remco, what do you get out of writing? And then Angeline.
Oh, what I get out of it is, well, yeah, that's a good question. I have to think about it a little bit. Um, I think even though we write fantasy and horror, we deal with the things that bother us in real life. There are things like religion, for example. Both in my own background, which was in a village where we had, uh, it was a small village. It had 2 pubs, but 4 different churches, and they were all Protestant churches. And um, during the week, people got on well enough, but on Sunday, nobody would speak with each other. You would have one group of people go one side of the street to one church, the other group would go the other side of the street to the other church. So yeah, there was a lot of you know difficulty around churches while I grew up. Also, my older brother, when he went to kindergarten, the teacher asked him like, "Well, and have you been baptized?" And he went like, "No." And she said like, "Then you will forever burn in hell." So it's kind of little things like that that kind of spoiled church for me. Um, I've become a little bit more relaxed about it. I can see the benefit of church and religion and faith for people in particular, but it's not for me. Also in Northern Ireland, we have, we've had a decades-long.
We've had basically, we now have a generation that has grown up sort of in the aftermath of a decades-long ethno-nationalist conflict, but the effects of that conflict are still felt because, surprisingly, you can't just write a peace agreement and have everyone sign it and then that makes it okay. And so I think that, like Rem, I'm exercising a lot of stuff because while I wasn't personally harmed in the Troubles, everybody who has grown up in Northern Ireland, we've all been shaped by living through times whenever people on a very fundamental level couldn't live together. And I think that what's coming out for me and the Red Man and others is, how do people cope with this? How do they build on top of the rubble with all the positives and negatives that that kind of connotes? I didn't think, there are things in my life where, again, it's not that the Troubles has been this massive personal struggle for me as it has for so many people who have really suffered. But I found out that I had more things to say about all of that, and especially about some more personal experiences with religion than I realized. And I think we've both really, it's been a bit of an exorcism in some ways. And so, you're writing about the bad things that people go through, but also about how they survive, and very particularly about how they survive together. I mean, in some ways, the book is kind of a love letter to the power of finding your people and how you change whenever you meet them. And it's kind of like, we've been really touched by how people have responded to that aspect of it, particularly. And I think that one of our sort of unstated goals with it was to, I suppose it's like a little fist bump to the people who have kind of held us up whenever we have had difficult times, and to those kinds of friendships as much as anything.
Yeah, so it's part of it is dealing with our own traumas is maybe a big word, but there you go.
Yeah.
But a huge chunk is indeed that we also want to write the stories that we want to read.
Yeah.
We want to write about the people we want to read about as well, and that is a huge motivation as well.
Yeah, and I mean, hearing that it has worked like that for people has given back to us an enormous amount.
Oh, well, that's excellent. That must be really gratifying to have people who connect with the whole found family, right? That's the term du jour, I think, in writing circles. Found family, good marketing term. Sorry, I was sounding cynical, but actually that kind of brings me to my next question, which is, I'm curious, I found myself, part of the reason I framed this podcast as me having just sharing with you my journey of writing the book I'm writing, as opposed to me telling you how to write the book that you're writing, is because I have found myself starting to kind of overdose on writing advice. There's so much online and so much obviously conflicting advice. I mean, I find there's so many of these binary axes of just, this week we're going to one end of the spectrum and next week, no, it's the other end, and then back and forth on any number of specific items, or maybe just this past week we've had all this hoo-ha about the cat person thing has come up back up into the news because it turns out the author of that short story, for listener, if you're not familiar, 4 years ago now, a short story called Cat Person went viral, all about a date that really didn't go very well, long story short. Short story short. And that has come up back into the news in the last week because someone realized that all kinds of details for that story were ripped out of their life and used in it. And it brought up a lot of Jim Jam online, the technical term. And there's one part here that I'm going to read for you guys, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on it. Which actually moves on from advice to, we'll come back to that, I guess, to a question I have about author presence in public. Emily Gould says here on Twitter, "The pressure on authors to be cuddly, relatable friends to all has been bad for everyone. I think we'd all be a lot better off if we lived in closer contact with the idea that writing, if you're serious about it, is profoundly antisocial and in some ways irreconcilably amoral." Now, I don't know about amoral, but yeah, how do you guys feel about sort of the author's public presence and all that kind of thing?
First of all, a lot of the writing advice that you get doesn't stick with us because we write together. So it's not a solitary thing at all. About dealing with an audience, So I think that the moment you put a story out there, you do not longer own it. Then it becomes part of the audience as well. So whatever someone else reads into it, what it means for someone, how they like it or not, you don't have any control over it. So it's not like, here is my story and this is what I mean with it. Yeah, you can do that as an author, but what someone else gets out of it, that's outside of your control. So you don't, in a way, you no longer own it. I'm not sure whether that's answering your question.
No, that's okay. I got a bit excited and kind of asked two questions at the same time. Sorry. So I guess, yeah, what I was trying to muddle my way towards there was basically, how do you feel about writing advice in general online? Do you find, like as you say, a lot of it bounces off you because you guys work together, and I imagine maybe that becomes kind of self-reinforcing? Maybe it's the opposite. You kind of worry about getting in a bubble, do you think? Or
Yeah, I think that for me, I mean, going back to sort of when I was first encountering writing advice, I think that I found a lot of it kind of alienating, because you would see a lot of stuff which was along the lines of, you need to be getting up at 5 a.m., before the business of the day starts. You need to get in a couple of hours a day. The big one that really I bounced off very hard was, you need to write every day. Because what would happen is that I would have the laptop by the bed, so as soon as I woke up, I would be trying to get my hour in. I would keep a record of my word count every day, and I would do well for a while. But then life would get overwhelming. I'm living with several chronic illnesses. At the time, my autism was also undiagnosed, and it has a huge impact on things like focus and executive function. So I was constantly pushing against all of these different challenges, and I was getting very frustrated with myself. And of course, every time that you fail to do what all the writing advice is telling you, you think, well, maybe I'm not a writer. There was also a big thing when I was younger. There was this idea, Erlen, that if you aren't totally enthusiastic about it all the time, if you don't have an enormous internal drive to write, then you're not a writer. And that haunted me for years, until I realized that I was dealing with some problems that not everyone is dealing with. I also, a lot of that was getting in the way of my enthusiasm, and it was creating a lot of fear, which was obscuring everything. So while, firstly, I don't think it's realistic to expect that you are going to be loving it at every minute, or that you will be driven at every minute. There's no other job where we expect that of people. And so I'm glad to see that that rhetoric is kind of dying now, perhaps because of the times we're living in, when it is tough out there for writers. So now, I mean, as Ram says, I'm not, I'm obviously not writing in isolation, but I try to take and leave writing advice based on what works for me. And I do particularly try to reflect back into the world, because I know a lot of other autistic and disabled writers are out there, perhaps also not relating very much to advice that seems to be written for people who have a lot of support and a consistent energy level. I'm trying to put a little more advice that's perhaps more realistic for the rest of us there.
Yeah, but you still, like a couple of weeks ago, was one of those big writers came out with, like, when you're doing a novel, you have to live the novel, you have to breathe the novel, you cannot think about anything else. All the rest of your life has to be put aside. And and I'm thinking, like, that's good and well for you, if that's your career and you don't have any other commitments. But most of us, we have a day job, we have to pay the rent, we have family obligations, and we do have to take care of our health as well. So that's just not going to work out for most of us. So I think most writers are not earning a lot of money out of it, so they have to do it in the small hours, whenever it's convenient. And when they've had a day at work, they might not have any brain left to write, because it's well, at least for me, it's not like I move beyond the keyboard and I just start pounding out words. That's, for me, it's not how it works. I have to.
It's more like mining sometimes, isn't it? You have to go down into the deep dark caves and dredge it up.
Yeah, and sometimes when your mental energy is low, it's you have to go really deep to get to that point where you're actually focused enough to write. and often that only happens in a weekend. So
no, you've got to find the resources when you can to do it. And I think I have a theory I'm curious to get your opinion on. I really do think that a lot of the writing advice is particularly, I would just say, toxic. I mean, the stuff that says, you've got to burn yourself down and forget about your loved ones, forget about the cat, get rid of the cat, focus more on the writing or whatever. All that kind of like raw, intense stuff. I think it's people who are trying to puff themselves up. I just think it's premium projection without thinking about the effect it might have on other people, particularly younger people who are trying to start their writing careers. And they maybe don't know that, this person's probably just puffing themselves up, saying you got to write every day for 2 hours between 5 and 7 or you're not real. Why all this focus on, as I say, the puffing themselves up, I think, and also there's very few professions, I think, where people are so fixated on if you are that thing or not. Are you a real writer? As you said, I think you touched on there, Angeline. You don't have people going around, are you a real plumber? Real plumbers do this thing. They plumb between 5 and 7 every day. It just doesn't happen. So do you think it's just this kind of, a lot of writing advice that gets put out there, particularly the stuff that's a bit obnoxious, is maybe just a product of the individual's insecurity? And one of the best lessons I think maybe people writing could learn is to spot that.
I think you're right. And also part of it, you can't really separate it either from the fact that most writers are also the main person doing PR for their own work. And social media especially, like you touched on it earlier, Oliver, there's a huge need to have a certain kind of appearance on social media, to be present in wider conversations about writing and also as a reader about fandom. There's such a lot of expectations around image that I think there's a danger sometimes that your energy can go into that more so than into the actual work. And the thing is, we're all in the same boat. We've all got this problem of our attention is being demanded from so many different angles. And it's not for nothing that we have, programs specifically designed to turn the internet off so that you can get some work done. And I freely admit that I rely on that myself. So I think that it can be hard sometimes when you see someone who is very present on social media, who is making these pronouncements, which, as you say, imply that their own writing life involves a monastic level of discipline. It can be hard to remember, that person has probably also had times when they've spent the morning, plunging the toilet, cleaning up cat vomit, trying to, stop their children from cutting each other's hair or whatever. But that's not the stuff that necessarily makes it into the lofty writing advice. And so you can end up with a very polarized view.
Yeah, so I do think that, it does take a certain dedication. You can't just put "I'm a writer" on your Twitter profile and then waiting for the words to come. That's the other
extreme.
That's the other extreme. So that's not it either. But I do think that, as there is a certain pressure to maybe be seen as more professional than you maybe are, because part of the time we don't know what we're doing, and you do something, you try it out, and you go like, that didn't work, and you backtrack, piece things together until it works. So there might be a bit of gatekeeping involved. Where you will also see that is the and that's been recently in particular, or that's never stopped, is writers putting down other ways of writing, other genres, but in particular like fanfic. Fanfic. That's not real writing. It doesn't count. It's no, you can't do that. That's you can't do that. So, and I've seen the same in the past in the art world, where people will say like, I like drawing and I'm painting, and people go like, but you can't call yourself an artist because you haven't done art academy and this and that. And I'm going like, no, just if you like drawing, if you like painting, just do it. Be creative.
At a certain point, doing the thing is what makes you the writer, makes you the artist, and we let a lot of other ideas get in the way of that.
Yeah, I agree. I think, again, it's this thing of, because it's a question of, are you a writer? We get this, it creates this gap of insecurity to come in and create all these behaviors. Plus the online thing where we, as you say, we have to sort of raise our humanity to a certain degree, and just be like, I'm a good productivity bot, masquerading as a human. And actually that brings me to sort of a sub-question of this, because of course we don't just write, we read, and we also look at other authors and their websites and Twitter feeds and all that stuff. I'm curious, what do you enjoy in what authors choose to share of themselves online?
That's a great question. I like it whenever authors talk about their influences, especially when the influences are a little bit oblique or not necessarily what you would expect from reading the thing, because I found that myself. I mean, you might think that whenever someone's writing sword and sorcery, then all the influences would be sword and sorcery. But in my experience, things often come from very different angles. And the other thing is, I really appreciate it whenever authors do acknowledge the times when things went wrong, the times when they didn't and still don't know all the answers. And, because we're always looking at other authors who are a bit ahead of us or who seem a lot ahead of us, and we're thinking that person is on a pedestal to which I shall never ascend. And then you realize that they also have concerns about their promotion. They're worried about how sales are going. I particularly do wish that we could admit more. I think that we're afraid of looking as if we're failing, so it can be hard to acknowledge sometimes the reality of, well, no, sales aren't where I would want them to be, or I'm finding it hard to break through in terms of, finding more Twitter followers, or I'm finding it hard to get some traction in terms of reviewers. I think the main way that does express itself is that you'll see people. I think the number one author exhortation and lament is, please guys review this book, because that is it is cliche to say, but it is one of the things that makes the biggest difference. And I think that is probably the point at which, author insecurity bubbles up the most, but at the same time, we have this huge pressure on us to kind of express it in a dignified way and not have it come out as, please, we're dying out here, tell someone that you liked our book. So at any time that authors are willing to say, you know what, it's challenging, I'm struggling, I would like things to be better. I love it whenever people are honest about that.
Yeah. So this is a general plea. Please review our book. Put your star rating on Goodreads. Put it on Amazon. Put a review on it if you really liked it. If you didn't like it, please don't, of course.
Yeah, no 1 star. I didn't get it. No. And actually, it's, you might be thinking, well, they have a bias. They wrote the book. I would also tell you to please go, if you read the book and like it, to Amazon and Goodreads and all those places and say, this was great. Because we're all chained to the algorithm right now. We can't do much about it. And yet it can be sometimes tiresome, even though you completely understand why they're saying it, to be following someone who makes something you like, whether it's authors of books or we've all watched a YouTube video and at the end it's like, please hit that, smash that like and subscribe button. And you're like, yeah, can I just enjoy the thing? Why do I have to have homework? Why can't I just enjoy the, but it's this conflicting impulse. On the one hand, you just want to enjoy the thing and not be given homework by the creator. On the other hand, you want the creator to keep making the thing and to be able to make the thing. So
at the same time, we're also readers, and so we also have that, please believe that we have our guilt stack of books which we have not read yet, have not reviewed yet, but have been meaning to. So we also understand it completely from a fan perspective, because writers are also all readers, we're also all fans, and so none of us is that perfect person who is banging out a new review every day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've got a guilt stack of my own. I actually had a calendar reminder, review the last 10 books you got. And I was like, I got through about 3 and then I had to do something. And then, yeah. But that almost comes back to, funny enough, I think it's like a cousin of how sometimes you see things like save local small businesses. And I'm like, I don't have enough money to buy from all of them constantly, but I do want them to be here. I do want the local bookshop. I do want the review cinema. I do want these authors to keep writing these books. And I only have so many resources. It's as if there's systemic issues with our society that need to be fixed, maybe to make things a little easier for everyone, but don't think too hard about that. Anyway, so on the flip side, I'm curious, no need to name names or anything, but what puts you off? What have you, when you, aside from maybe the obnoxious writing advice, where it's just like burn yourself to the ground, that we were talking about a minute ago, when you're looking at an author's website or their newsletter or their Twitter feed, where's the line for you between being very honest about what's up with them, which Angeline, I couldn't agree more. I'm trying to do that with the podcast, we'll see, but that always with that fear of showing my arse in it. But then, I will say that, like just I did right now, and then I'll go look at Anonymous' website, and he's talking about how sick his mum is, and I'm like, I'm sorry for your mum, but I came here to read about your book. So where for you is the line in terms of like, maybe I don't need to hear this?
Well, actually, I might. For me, it's a bit different. Like, and it's especially for Twitter. Um, if there is a sweet spot between promoting your book and talking about yourself, and like, hey, I saw this on television, or like, this was an absolute bad day or something like that. If someone's Twitter feed is in particular, every day, every hour, the same advertisements of buy my book, please buy my book, especially when there is that desperation behind it. It does um, turn me off. If someone's Twitter feed is nothing else but the promo for the book, it's not good. I unfollow.
I think for me, it comes from another direction. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I think that this is a very big conversation on book Twitter in general, I am more inclined to unfollow if I feel that someone is talking more about the things that they dislike than the things they like, or when I feel as if they are veering a little bit too much into that direction of basically. There's always a huge tension between, on the one hand, a culture of accountability, and on the other hand, a culture of, well, witch hunts and accusations. And I've often noticed that we have a bit of a problem on Twitter where we can get very focused on, is that person coming from an authentic place when they're writing about this identity? You see pressure on people to out themselves or to perform their identity in a way that is recognizable to readers. And of course, readers, there's so many different readers that how can my disabled identity as expressed in my writing be legible to every single disabled person? The answer is it can't. So, and we all are at risk of doing this. I mean, I've definitely had phases on Twitter where I am complaining about things that bother me in the book world more than I am, uplifting the books that I've loved and the authors who have inspired me. And so when it gets to the point where I feel that someone is building a platform mainly by pulling others down, that's when I unfollow.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I actually have an index card taped to the top of my monitor, mostly for when I'm pitching shows to people. But in general, I try to think about it because they're always kind of pitching yourself when you put yourself online. Don't say what you aren't, say what you are. And this is a little, I forget where I first read that. It's not my piece of advice, but I think it's a good one to just kind of be like, hey, here's my neat book and here's some neat stuff, rather than, well, my book's better than so-and-so. It has a more authentic presentation of XYZ. Yeah, exactly, right? So yeah, I just think it's just more pleasant. Just a better way to kind of put yourself out there. So I have a slightly darker question. I'm kind of curious. How much of a role does fear and anxiety play in your writing? Because I find my fear of being judged sometimes influences my choices in a scene that I'm doing.
I think that it's huge, but I mean, definitely, the fear of being judged and of how will people see my approach to that particular thing I'm writing about, that is definitely a concern. And sometimes it becomes a really naughty puzzle for me to work my way through. But I think there's a much deeper fear that is actually influencing my writing, because I worked out a while ago that a lot of my writing is actually in some way about death. And considering like my life experiences and, and my background, I think that's understandable. But it's always interesting to me how unconscious some of this is. I mean, I didn't set out to, for my writing to always be about mining my deepest fears, but they come out in disguised form in my writing, and often I don't understand exactly what something meant until later on.
Yeah, and the topic of death, in some way, it's not only coming from her, but I'm now thinking of some stories where I'm thinking like, yeah, but that one, it definitely came from my side, because writing together, sometimes one person has an idea, the other riffs on it, and then you talk about it, and at the end you don't really know who contributed what part to it. Going back to your question, I would say dealing with fear, yes, we definitely have these moments of like, that everything is terrible, there is no there's no point to it, and why are we doing this, and etc. etc. Well, that's also when it's good to be with the two of us, because usually the other is then a little bit more level-headed and goes like, okay, let's talk through it and let's see what we can practically do, or like let's go back to the ground. I think we've had it very seldom that we both were in the same state of despair.
I think that's very true. It's like I was reading an interview yesterday with someone, and they were talking about how they had heard somebody talking about what was the secret to their long, successful marriage. And the answer turned out to be, there was no day when we both hated each other at the same time. And I think for us, there was no day when we were both in despair at the same time. You have to alter, you're kind of, one of you is carrying the sort of writerly insecurity, imposter syndrome, despair, etc. One of you is carrying the ball for a while, and then, the other is taking a ball and the other is kind of heaving them upwards. And I think that's the way it goes.
I love that. And actually, it brings me back to a question I meant to ask at the start. Oh, well, here we are. I have collaborated with people on screenplays, but never another writer. It'll be like a director, so that's a very different relationship, usually uneven in one direction or another. My prose writing has been 100% just me. So I'm very curious to know how you guys do it as a team. What's your sort of method? And how did it go the first time you tried?
It's hard to remember, but I think I know. Actually, the first time we tried was probably, we had the idea for a picture book, which kind of developed shortly before we started to be in a relationship with each other. But it was one of those very long things where we both had feelings that neither of us knew how to voice, and so there was an atmosphere. Let's put it that way. And I think that we kind of traded ideas back and forth. That picture book has still not been written, by the way. They could have found their way into other things. Our method, though, is we work in alternating drafts, and so it's layered. And the fact, maybe he'll come up with a synopsis, I'll do the first draft proper. Crucially, these are always separate files, because whenever you have two people working and, you go through such a process with something you're writing, sometimes one of you is going to be too editing happy, is going to cut it down too much. Sometimes you're going to change your minds mutually about what direction something should go in. And only towards the end do you realize, what, we actually need to sprinkle some ideas we had at the beginning of this thing for flavor. And so you go back to one of your earlier drafts. So our process is that we alternate, and that we don't get in each other's way. Whenever it's someone's turn, whenever someone is working on a draft of the thing, obviously the other person can say, hey, what about I meant to say, and then that can go into the side notes, But I think that in the early years we worked out that, certainly for me, what really doesn't work is to show a draft partway through. That's a cast iron rule of mine, because otherwise I lose my sense of what my own intent is, and I lose confidence, especially, I really need to be alone with the thing to make it work.
Yeah, I need approval to keep myself going. So I'll, show my paragraph that I've written. Like, look, isn't this a nice paragraph? And Angeline goes like, yeah, that's very nice. And then I write the next paragraph. So, within our method, we do work a little bit differently. I think we have developed a certain house style where we are being able to work towards a common voice. And within that as well, I think we're, the main thing we've learned is not to be too precious about our prose or our, anything that we've written. Sometimes you do have bits where you think like, this is really important. Or if you then see it 2 drafts further that it's been removed, and you can always go back and say, like, hey, why did you remove that? Discuss it. Mm-hmm. And then either, you reinstate it, or you don't. I don't think we have had any big fights over it.
I think that we're more likely to have misunderstandings over intent than anything else. But the thing is also, a lot of discussion happens in between. A lot of the important stuff about character arcs actually just happens with us chatting to each other. Like, we'll just spontaneously get into a long late night discussion about Sebastian, and what the sort of what his early childhood has done to him, and then that will become a guiding sort of principle for different stories that we are working on. But yeah, the process of doing actual drafts, one phrase we use a lot, if we're going back and forth about whether does that sentence work or not, does that idea need to be introduced here or not, we use the phrase, but that's not a hill I need to die on a lot. If there's something where, well, this is why I have it in, or this is why I phrased it like that. But in the end, if we are trying to cut things to make word count, it's not, a number one priority.
And one thing we've started doing, and not that long ago, is to, go through the story together at the very end.
We read it out loud.
Yep.
That's key. You have to read it out loud.
And then sometimes there you do end up debating about a single comma or a sentence, and you try out different versions, and it goes really down into the nitty-gritty of it, but it does really strengthen it.
And especially, I think the thing with the reading out loud part is that you hear problems in sentence rhythm that you won't really catch in any other way.
Yeah, or you have written a beautiful sentence, and then while you read it aloud, you go like, yes, that's a beautiful sentence, but what does it mean? Why is it there?
Or you hit the double entendres. Sometimes, we both have the sense of humor of a 12-year-old, so most of the time we catch those things, but every so often something slips by us, and then we realize, okay, it's good we found that. Or now and then you want to leave it in for effect, but yeah, these things happen.
Yeah, somebody's delivering a big package. Oh no, yeah, I have to get that out. Oh, that was wonderful. Okay, I'm curious. Also, sorry, before I move on, would it be condescending if I said I think it's bloody adorable you met while working on a story? And I'm glad the relationship worked out, if not the book yet. That book may still happen, maybe.
Yeah, well, we do. Look, I'm a hoarder, so
He's a hoarder.
I've got bits and pieces of paper and also computer files which date back decades and decades ago. Actually, the Red Man itself, it was based on an idea that I had like 20 years ago. Every now and then I will go through the stack of old papers and go like, oh yeah, we can do something with this. That original picture book idea of us, it might still happen.
Yeah, nothing ever really goes away. I think if we had one bit of advice, to be honest, that would be it. Don't be too quick to throw out your ideas. This is the purpose of digital storage. You don't have to be limited by the amount of space you have for old notebooks.
Yeah, be thrifty.
Yeah, I agree with that very much so. I think kill your darlings. Well, maybe instead of killing them, just cut them and paste them out somewhere else and hold on to them. And Remco, I feel you on the hoarding. I just had a series of computer calamities that led me to have all of my adult life's creative output in digital format on a single creaky hard drive that made horrible, horrible noises. Listener, you can't see Angeline's eyes just went wide. And luckily I was able to get everything off that shaky little arc into new digital storage fairly quickly, but it was a bit horrifying for about a week there. I was thinking, oh yeah, right, digital hard drives last about 10 years. This one I got 12 years ago. So, okay, we're getting near the end here. One quick question before we sort of wrap up. You guys have been doing a lot of promotion for your book, as you do. I'm curious, is there anything you wish people would ask you in interviews?
We're both looking very glassy-eyed. I just want to say audio medium, and I want you to get the full effect.
I don't know.
Anything you wish you could I would like to talk about that in the interview, but they never ask me about the cat.
I think we're pretty good at shoehorning our pet subjects into interviews at this point.
I honestly think it's what I would say is actually I'm curious about what your view of this is, or how it works for you is. Look, for us, writing Sword and Sorcery, it's in a way, it's a means, it's not a goal. Well, originally, we did have this thought of, we really like Robert E. Howard's work, so we would love to write something like Robert E. Howard, just like his Farringtown horror stories. We really wanted to write something like that and ended up with something completely different. But, what we found is that it's important to, even when you're writing within a genre, it's a means, it shouldn't be the goal in itself. So that's why we tend to pick all these different influences from inside of ourselves, but also from other genres, other media, etc. So I'm actually wanting to ask you, how does it work for you, and what influences other than outside of Sword and Sorcery do you bring to your work?
Well, I definitely try to consider other mediums. Like I say, I write screenplays, so I think a lot about television and film guardedly, because I want to write a novel, not a treatment for a screenplay, which can happen by accident sometimes. As far as the genre, Sword and Sorcery, I've been obsessively reading as much as I can get my hands on for the last 2.5 years or so, and I really enjoy how Brian Murphy defines it, the sort of 7 qualities he names in his book Flame and Crimson. But he says in that book, you don't have to checkmark all 7 in every story, otherwise it's not sword and sorcery. And it's not fun to be overly dogmatic about what gets through the gate and what doesn't. He said that when he was talking about Jack Vance's Dying Earth series, which isn't exactly, Conan stuff, is it? But he made a good argument for saying you could consider at least some of it as sword and sorcery. So, and here I am writing this untitled sword and sorcery novel, and the whole first third, I'm not sure it qualifies as sword and sorcery. It's all about the main character kind of becoming a sword and sorcery protagonist, which she then is for very much the back 2/3 of the novel. And does that mean I did it wrong? I don't think so. I think it's the genre is my starting off point, and what it is by the end, we'll see. I'll think about that when it comes to time to market it and so on and so forth. But I'm still finishing the outlining, so I've got lots of time to faff about and not worry about that. But yeah, I do think being overly dogmatic is the death of creativity, and it will straitjacket you and make writing harder. And I think everything you do when you're writing should be about reducing friction, not making it harder for yourself. So yeah, that would be my thought on that. Okay, so we're just about at the end here. Before we wrap up, I'm going to link the hell out of this, but some people might not look at those links. Where can people find you and buy your stuff?
Well, you can find our paperback, and we do encourage you to grab the paperback version because it has lots of extra flash fiction, illustrations, and making of material. You can find that on Amazon. Whichever country you're in, your version of Amazon will have our book. You can also find more of our writing at our blog, which is turniplanterns.wordpress.com. And you can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/Angeline B. Adams or Remco Straten.
Yeah, the Remco van Straten was already taken.
It was taken. There's another review of it.
Yeah, it is. There is. The last I heard from him is that he was selling dodgy timeshare apartments. That's not me.
So not that guy.
Yeah, I've got a URL squatter sitting on my last name, brackenbury.com. I'm waiting for the alert that tells me one day when he lets it go instead of trying to sell it to me for $40,000 or whatever the hell. Sure, man, I'll be right on that. Great. Okay, so yeah, so you've heard that, folks. Again, I will link all of that in the show notes and probably share it as well on the show's Twitter. And yeah, absolute final question. In brief, what are you working on now?
Well, at this very moment, I'm working on a novella about Kaila's origin story, which started out as a sword and sorcery thing, but I have just this week removed pretty much all of the sorcery from it and some of the sword play as well. No, I was looking, it had been on the shelf for a while to rest and, to have a clear view on it. And I was reading through it and I was looking at it and thinking I only put this stuff in to, tick that, sorcery box or this sword box. And I thought it's not really strengthening the story. So I chucked it out. So I'm kind of redrafting that. Well, first, just making lots of notes of what I would want to have in it. It's more about getting the emotional arc right and whether the protagonists of it, there's a Kaila and another woman, whether their relationship towards each other, whether it works over a span of time. So that's more important to me than whether Kaila meets a couple of wolves and makes them into wolfskin pelts. That stuff is that's not important. For the rest, we're working on some stories about
technology and death. We had some steampunk ideas, some ideas where little shadings of science fiction veer into the horror, and we've also been getting out our enthusiasm for old Hollywood movies that way as well.
Yeah, I saw you tweeting a bit. Are you working on a short story set during the making of a film from the 20s, or am I?
We are indeed. But it's a slightly alt universe thing. So in our story, the Laurence Olivier version of Wuthering Heights happened a lot earlier than it did in real life, with associated complications.
We were interested in doing something steampunky, but we did want to go beyond the let's give the people top hats with goggles on. You start with a basic idea of okay, we'll start with a world in which World War I didn't happen, but the Spanish flu happened and happened again and happened again. This is actually one of those ideas that I had 20 years ago, so it's nothing to do with Corona.
It's just relevant now.
Yeah.
So, and then you start to think about this? Like, what consequences did it have? So yeah, and just for fun, like, okay, they were filming Wuthering Heights, but technology was way back, so it will be silent movie. Laurence Olivier will still be a prima donna, but it's a little bit different setting. It gives me another opportunity to draw in my love for old silent movies and their aesthetics as well. So yeah, that's a blast. Whether we manage to sell it, that's something else altogether. But we love doing it.
Watch this space.
Yeah, well, good luck. And I think, it's a wonderful sounding idea. I'm certainly sold on it. And now, if I remember correctly, there might be plans for a Red Man and the Others sequel if it is financially viable, which it has to be. So buy the book, listeners. Buy some for your friends. That's what I did. I got a couple of copies for friends I thought would really like it. But yes, so there might be a sequel, yes?
Yes, we're hoping so. I mean, in the end, it's all about, we're not fast writers, and he's doing it on top of the day job. So we're having to think very carefully about, is there an audience out there for it? Can we justify putting our time into focusing on this versus putting it into other projects? So yes, I mean, people buying a book is a big factor in that.
Yeah, but we do have the ideas. And we have some drafts, like, sometimes it's very crude outlines. We do want to track these characters, also what happened with them before, like how did they get where they are, but also like, what happens in 5 years' time, what happens in 20 years' time. We do want to look back on them.
Yeah, we want to meet them at various stages of their lives.
Yeah, I would very much be into that. Yeah. So yeah, and of course, this is something some fans don't seem to like hearing. Oh, it matters how much money they make, whether or not they write a certain thing. They have financial concerns like everybody else alive. Yeah. Yeah, that can be hard to put out there as well, right? I almost feel kind of like how people push to have people working at companies share their income with each other to help generate, a push for income equality, right, between, say, men and women or whatever. And in a similar vibe, I think if more writers were just really not bitter, but just honest about, money is a factor in my life too, believe it or not. It's not just the muse, then maybe that would help us all, I think, readers and writers. Okay, so thank you very much for speaking with me today. Again, folks, I'm going to link to the book like crazy, website, Twitter, show notes, everywhere. Please consider going off and buying a copy, buying a few copies, give some to your friends. It's great. I strongly, strongly recommend it. Thank you for joining me, Remco. Thank you for joining me, Angeline.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Right, take care, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.
And that was the first interview on So I'm Writing a Novel. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I definitely want to do more. I certainly had a whale of a time talking to Remco and Angeline. And before I go, I just want to take a moment to thank and to shout out to the patrons on the show's Patreon, whose support has helped me do all kinds of things to invest in the show and the writing of the novel, including paying for the software that allowed me to do a better quality recording of that interview and make life easier for me in the editing. The software, by the way, if you're curious, was called Iris. Anyway, so shout out thank you to Matt DeBarth, Heather Gay, Rodney Karlstrom, Peter, Tom, Kier, John Taylor, Sophie, T. Momo, Charlie J., and Christina Manouge. Thank you all, and I hope if you are not a patron, you might consider becoming one. There's all kinds of fun rewards, including a whole bonus podcast. Check it out over on patreon.com/so I'm writing a novel. All right, thanks everybody. I'll see you next week.